So welcome to the Hixon Center Podcast series. The Hixon Center for Sustainable Environmental Design is an interdisciplinary center at Harvey-Mudd College in Claremont, California, which was created in 2015 to initiate, support, and coordinate college-wide programs and activities related to sustainability research, teaching, and practice. So one of our newer efforts to engage the campus and the Claremont College's community on sustainability topics is through this podcast series. And in each podcast, we hope to bring in individuals who can speak to some contemporary environmental issues, as well as their own background and work. So we hope you'll enjoy, and for more information on the Hixon Center, you can find us online at hmc.edu/hcsed. So with us today is Brinda Sarathy, who is an associate professor of environmental analysis at Pitzer College and serves as the director of the Robert Redford Conservancy for Southern California Sustainability at Pitzer. And today we brought Brinda in to learn a little bit more about her background and her journey up to this point, her perspectives on environmental justice and education on campus and beyond, and to learn a little bit more about what the Conservancy is all about. So hello, Brinda, and thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So for context, Brinda and I have a little bit in common. We both went to Berkeley at one point in our lives, and we both work for centers with very long names. But I figured we should get started with you telling us a bit about yourself, and maybe tell us a bit about where you're from and how you grew up, and sort of any stories that you might have to tell about how you got here.
Sure. So I am, whenever people ask me that question, where am I from, I have to take pause because I'm from a number of different places. I have lived in the United States since 2000 when I came to California for graduate school, but I was born in Canada.
Okay.
And typical immigrant story, I suppose. My parents ended up immigrating to Canada. They actually met in Canada in the late 1960s and had a family. But at the age of 5, my father got a job in Saudi Arabia. And it's really kind of funny, interesting, ironic that me and my 3 siblings are all in environmentally oriented fields.
Oh, wow.
And my father worked for the largest producer of crude oil in the world, Saudi Aramco, which is the largest oil company, which produces crude. So I grew up in Saudi Arabia for the first 14 years of my life in sort of a campus colony setting, very much like American military installations abroad. This was a similar type of setup where the expats lived in these Leave It to Beaver compounds, and then the Saudis were outside the compound. The company and the government did not encourage very much mixing between the two groups. And so even though we were allowed, initially the schools offered Arabic. By the time I was in kindergarten, they stopped. So we had Arabic in kindergarten, and then after that it was just all American education, which is really unfortunate in hindsight in terms of the opportunity to have learned another language, to engage in another culture and be much more sort of culturally fluent was quite limited and purposefully done by both the Americans and the Saudi government. At the age of 14, and this is another interesting company policy, they felt that the teenagers had to be shipped abroad because they didn't want bad influences to remain in the country. So by bad influences, sex, drugs, alcohol, teenagers were seen as sources of sin. And so the company, Aramco, subsidized high school education for company employees. And most of my friends went to very fancy East Coast prep schools, primarily in the United States. And my parents said I had a choice. I could go and live with relatives if I wanted to go to the U.S. and go to public schools, or I could go to India. I mean, so I didn't mention this in the beginning, but native of South India. My parents are both South Indian. I'm, of South Indian descent, ethnicity. And so I ended up going to a boarding school in Kodaikanal, South India, which is sort of on the border of Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the Western Ghats. it was and is. It's a beautiful area of the country, really, really unique tropical mountain forests. Montane is the ecological term. And that was really my first exposure to kind of what one might consider being really out in nature. Saudi Arabia was obviously a different type of landscape, desert, a lot of water scarcity, and although it was pretty highly irrigated, completely different landscape in Kodaikanal. And I've said this elsewhere, but that was really my first exposure to like a direct relationship between how we used our resources and what we saw around us. So when there was water shortages because of a lack of rain, we limited the number of showers we took. The source of hot water was firewood, and so we would see people actually cutting down trees and carrying them, typically women, and that was like sort of a basic source of fuel and heat. So all of these things just became sort of intimately part of the environment. And so when one thinks about the natural world, for me, it was always imbricated with like the social world, and like you can't really separate those two. I went back to Canada for college. I was at McGill, and I pursued an ad hoc major, something I created, international development and environmental studies, pretty interdisciplinary, taking courses in economics, sociology, geography, development classes, some natural science. And then I took some time off after undergraduate to, what people refer to as a gap year. And I ended up going to rural Gujarat, of all places. And Gujarat is a state in Western India. And I was doing an internship with the Aga Khan Rural Support Program. I lived in a tribal area of Gujarat, primarily Vasavas. And so part of the work I did there as an intern is, first of all, I picked up Gujarati, the language there. And I interviewed a number of female members of the households. They were basically engaging at that time, and this would have been in the late 1990s. There was a whole wave of what was called women in development and woman and development, thinking about gender and development. How do you empower women through putting them in charge of particular types of organizations, or panchayats, sort of village organizations, village councils. And I wanted to see if this was actually just talk that donors wanted to see, or if something was actually happening structurally. And so I interviewed women to see if they were actually in charge of the Mahila Vikas Mandals, which are the word Mahila's woman. So Mahila Vikas Mandals are like woman-headed development councils. I did that for about 8 to 11 months, and then kind of wrote up a report for this foundation, and then ended up coming back to Canada. Long story short, after some time, applied to graduate schools and decided to go to Berkeley to pursue what I thought at the time was going to be looking at gender and development issues in South Asia. But when I got to Berkeley, my first kind of time at Berkeley is I went to forestry camp, and I don't know, Louis, if you're familiar with that.
Yeah,
did you go to forestry camp?
I did not go, but I have a lot of friends who did.
Yeah, it was 6 weeks out in the Plumas National Forest near Quincy, Northern California, learning about California forests and all the issues. And one of the things that was really interesting to me, so we met a whole bunch of people, guest speakers came in, Forest Service officials, loggers, and there was still a lot of debate back then about jobs versus the environment, the spotted owl issue, and like how there had been basically no logging on national forests in light of the Endangered Species Act and habitat for spotted owl. So, and then of course lots of hiking, doing ecology, a lot of perspectives on looking at trees in terms of timber. So I did that, and then I started taking classes at Berkeley, and I was always attuned to the fact that there were not that many other students of color in the program. And, thinking about these questions of equity and access in relation to the environment, just based on my time in Kodi, as well as Gujarat, who has access, what are the struggles? And I came across this little publication called Voices from the Woods that was put out by an organization called the Jefferson Center, a nonprofit in Southern Oregon. And it was literally just interviews with people who worked in the woods. And these ended up being Southeast Asian mushroom harvesters, Latino forest workers, and salal harvesters. Salal is a type of bear grass and floral greens. And I had, this was the first time I was reading about these types of groups in relation to forestry. And it was a bit of a double take for me because none of their voices had been represented at all in my 6 weeks of forestry camp. So I kind of looked into the literature. There was nothing I could find written in the peer-reviewed literature. And so I applied for a pre-dissertation, research fellowship grant. And I spent the summer, I basically looked up the Jefferson Center and contacted the person. It was Beverly Brown, one-person operation. And that's how I basically got interested in this issue of who else works in the woods. And it was primarily Latino labor in forestry. So I ended up doing my dissertation research on the changing nature of the workforce in forestry, looking in Southern Oregon, but that it can be generalized more generally to the U.S. West and probably more nationally.
Wow. So that's all through your time up to when you finish up at Berkeley. And that's what year is that? Around like 06, 07 when you wrap up there?
Exactly. I graduated in 2006, and then I came down to Riverside, where I had a postdoc at UC Mexis at the University of California, Riverside for about 2 years.
Okay, gotcha.
When I was writing up articles, putting on programs for UC Mexis, and looking for jobs.
Yeah. And so then not long after that, you came to Pitzer, right?
That's right. That's right. I actually interviewed with Pitzer in, oh my goodness, I think I interviewed with Pitzer in 2007 and was given an offer. But I postponed for a year, and I started at Pitzer in 2008.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
And so you were there in 2008, but the Conservancy didn't actually come until, 2012 or so?
That's right. So I started in Pitzer 2008, kind of fresh out of grad school or almost, and started teaching classes. And, I developed a class in environmental justice.
Right.
That was more U.S.-based. I taught classes in U.S. environmental policy and classes on sort of global resources, resource issues. The Conservancy really came on board only in, like you said, 2012, 2013. And this was, prior to my time as director. We had a previous director hired in 2013.
Okay.
And then I came on board in 2015.
Gotcha. So you started as the director of the center in 2015. So walk us through what's happened since then. So what sort of programs has the center established? Obviously now it's developed a bigger physical presence. The center has been
good question.
Been built,
so for me, starting in 2015, my main priority was to create a process that was both highly collaborative and transparent in terms of how can we come together and create a vision for the Conservancy, because my deep belief is you can't impose something that's top down. Rather, I wanted to identify the strengths that Pitzer College already has, sort of leverage those in order to bring faculty and students to become the heart and spirit of the Conservancy. So I want to maybe preface that because it's not just about having built a beautiful building. It's about what is the whole mission and purpose of this. And so when I came on board in 2015, one of the first things I did was start a student fellows program to reach out to students and engage them basically gave them the opportunity to collaboratively plan an institution, which is a pretty unique opportunity. And part of that, and that was initially formed around an independent study. I had people apply into it and looking at issues of sustainability in Southern California. But the students were also leaders in their own way on environmental justice issues on campus. And I wanted them to be kind of the cheerleaders and ambassadors of the Conservancy before there was actually a site.
Sure.
So for the first 2 years, I mean, we just developed programming activities around sustainability issues, or around things like environmental justice tours, building like excitement and resuscitating something that had been dormant for a while. In terms of the collaborative planning process, I was the one to spearhead a planning process which brought together faculty and students over the fall semester in conjunction with our design firm, Carrier Johnson, to have conversations, very in-depth conversations about what are the types of programs we wanted to see, what was going to be the mission and focus of this, what was the process going to be, and it was really process-driven. So in that, I also brought in members of the Tongva community. Tongva are people natives to this area. They're federally unrecognized, but this was, again, leveraging a strength Pitzer had. Pitzer has had longstanding relationships and partnerships with a couple of Tongva elders, Barbara Drake and Julia Bogany, amongst others. And this has been facilitated by other faculty, Eric Steinman, Paul Falstich, Joe Parker, over the years, Scott Scoggins, amongst others. And so bringing them in to talk about the importance of land, the importance of the plants that were sacred to them, and that became folded into the development of actually what to plant, the landscaping decisions. We also brought in members of the art faculty, because Pitzer has had a really well-known program that melds art and the environment. And so ultimately, the kind of programs that come out of the Conservancy are also reflected in the types of spaces we have. And then finally, of course, like central to this were the biologists, the Keck scientists, the ecologists, because people have been using the site of the Bernard Field Station for decades, right, to do research across the colleges.
Right.
And the idea of the Conservancy now being adjacent to that, one of the things we wanted to do was leverage and enhance and support the work already taking place at the Bernard Field Station to support a program such as Leadership in Environmental Education, which was a program founded by Paul Falstich at Pitzer College. So we had all these different pieces, lots and lots of meetings with faculty across the colleges, faculty at Pitzer, as well as people in the neighborhood around the Conservancy. And then the next phase, so by November, after this very intense planning process, I had to come up with an academic programming statement. We had different program areas. So we have ecology, field-based ecology programs, environmental education. We'll plan to hold policy classes, art and the environment, and the student fellows program. But the idea here is like really about interdisciplinarity and how can all these different people engage with the environment in different ways, and then through that maybe cross-pollinate to think about solutions or approaches to challenges in the region, environmental challenges in the region. I've lost my train of thinking. Oh, yeah. So in November, we came out with the planning document. And then in January, we went out to bid for, okay, how is that document going to be translated into actual space and the design of the facility? So then in January, we ended up going again with Carrier Johnson. So January through July was a pretty, again, collaborative process where we came up with a design for the site, and that was very, very involved, again, involving members of the Native community, scientists, all the faculty who were planning to use the space. And we actually broke ground for renovation. Really, it started in earnest in December of 2016, and it was a pretty tight process in terms of December 2016, and we have opened for programs in January of 2018. So it was a year and change.
Wow.
And so I became a faculty member who became fairly conversant with contractors, learned all about MEP, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, things that I completely not in my wheelhouse. But what was helpful is I was able to, I think, ask questions and also push, because sometimes I think certain things were being told we needed to do. And I said, well, hey, why do we need to have centralized air conditioning in this former infirmary building that was built in 1931 that never really had it? And you've got amazing thermal mass in this building. You have windows. You can do circulation. We can do big ceiling fans. And so we were able to think in terms of simplicity for sustainability rather than only high-tech. Even though the building has high-tech features, it's the first net zero building at the Claremont colleges, fully solar-powered with the arrays on the outdoor classrooms. It's also thinking about one of the goals is, as people walk up to the site, I want them to experience seasonality. I want them to see and smell the different plants, and how do they look at different points in time. And then once you're actually up in the building, around the building, like, can you take off a layer or put on a layer rather than hermetically basically control everything around you. And it's a work in progress, but if you haven't been there, you should come, and I know you have. It's a lovely space, and it's really an inside and outdoor sanctuary. And we get a number of requests from people from across the colleges for retreats up there and holding classes and all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's a truly unique space at the colleges. I really enjoyed the tour, and I was amazed at how in short of a time you turned that building into a complete and comprehensive learning and community space.
Yeah, and I wanted to just add that the learning and community space, I really saw every point of the process as a teachable moment. And so even in the renovation process, so we took student fellows in prior to the building being renovated. So can you imagine walking in the pitch dark with flashlights into this like quite haunted looking space? And then in the process of the renovation, like we had interventions with media studies students, graffiti artists coming in, photographers and visiting artists coming in. And so we're actually putting on an exhibit April 28th based on the photographs of all those interventions that basically look at the changing nature of the site over time. And it's really, really beautiful.
Well, congratulations on getting that done. That's an incredible milestone for anyone, and of course for Pitzer and for the Conservancy. So, if you're listening and you haven't checked it out, go do it. Go do it. It's definitely worth checking out. But turning back a bit as well, so that's the Conservancy. Turning a bit back to your courses as well, because you mentioned that you teach an environmental policy course, you teach an environmental justice course. I was curious to learn a little bit more about the aims and your goals in each of those courses. What do you hope on a more general level those students will leave with from each of those different courses?
Yeah, I also teach a class called Hustle and Flow on California water policy. So with environmental justice, this is an interesting course because there had not been an EJ course at the colleges until I came, and I wanted to develop not just an environmental justice course, but I wanted to make it a core class for at least the Pitzer major. And I've found, and not just me, but our field group has found, it's really changed the orientation of how students perceive the environment from a more political ecology approach, which I know you're familiar with that from Berkeley, but looking back in time, looking at questions again of access, equity, whose stories get told in relation to what we call nature or what we call the environment, and what are the implications of that in terms of governance, in terms of policy, in terms of the narrative. So the environmental justice course is actually it's a critical perspective on U.S. history, looking at natural spaces. And trying to figure out, why certain groups don't have access now. So we read W.E.B. Du Bois. We look at Carol and Merchant's work on gender and the environment, Carol and Finney's work, Black Faces, White Spaces, and things like urban policy, redlining. And what's surprising is not many of my students have been in many cases exposed to,
Sure.
you know,
Absolutely.
the histories in the U.S.
Yeah.
around, well, why do we have the types of environments we have?
Right.
And one of the things that the course does, because environmental justice traditionally has just looked at contaminated spaces, you know,
Sure.
kind of in Bob Bullard's framework,
Yeah.
and disproportionate impact.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, of course, build on that, but also break out of that to also think about, well, what are the other spaces? Can we think about the prison industrial complex in relation to environmental issues? And certainly Ruthie Gilmore's work talks much about prisons in the Central Valley and detention facilities and water rights and alliances between traditional environmentalists and abolitionists, prison abolitionists. And just thinking more, I think, critically about the environment and the natural world in relation to social justice issues has reframed how my students tend to question or approach these issues. Sure. And perhaps like question the canon too. You know, John Muir is not just uncritically deified.
Right.
He's a complicated character. And I think that complication is necessary, although certainly not comfortable for people who might have had a more privileged perspective on Muir's legacy.
Sure.
So that's what that course has done, and the way we've seen how it's shifted EA is in terms of the senior theses and
Right.
kind of the questions that are asked. And certainly, you know, they take, our students they're very broadly focused, so they take on other issues as well. The policy classes I teach tend to look more closely just at policy issues or the history. Like Hustle and Flow has been a great class to teach, especially this semester. I have had a really diverse group in the class in terms of even disciplinary backgrounds, history, English majors, people in the sciences. And when I asked them, well, why are you in this class if you're not an EA major? They said, we just want to know about water in California. We want to know about the place we're in. And so there's like, that was really gratifying and exciting to hear, that
Sure.
there's like very place-based interest to learning about where you are right now, which is great.
Yeah.
Where does your water come from? And so in that class, we go through the history of like hydraulic society in California. We look at particular policies. And I also really try to bring in a lot of connected guest speakers to give our students the opportunity to network and hopefully move into the water world.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's something called a silver tsunami that's coming in the water world, which is the retirement of many older, largely white males in the profession. And we just had a guest lecturer coming and telling us it was called the silver tsunami and saying there's going to be a lot more space opening up in relation to professions in the water field.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how, I imagine there's quite a few discussions in those courses, and I'm curious about, for one, how do you find that the students, especially in the early going, are those challenging conversations for them? Do you feel that they have to wrestle with things that they have never even, not just never even thought about or observed before, but maybe it actually sparks some personal reflection? And the second part of the question being, obviously we're living in a pretty unique time right now, and post the recent presidential election, how has the tone of your conversations in those courses changed? And does that come in a lot more now than perhaps you either anticipated or ever had before?
That's a good question, and I think that's probably more apt for the environmental justice class,
Sure.
where we're really looking at issues of identity, race, class, gender, in relation to the environment. But, what I found is my first couple of years teaching the class, I think it was more challenging for students in
Sure.
relation to grappling with these issues. But I think a lot of these issues now are a central part of what students grapple with. And I think that's part of the larger social ecosystem with Black Lives Matters,
Right.
with like police brutality against, people of color on the streets. All of these things with, even with Me Too,
Yeah.
and with gun violence, and just even the most recent like mobilization by young people in this country, and certainly with climate justice
You're right.
activism, I've really seen a shift since, 2000. 15
Wow.
on, where youth are much more mobilized, much more what you would call woke on all of these issues. And we've seen it on all of the campuses here, as you can bear testament to.
Sure.
You've got a changing demographic, both in California, but also nationally. And, people are speaking up and out. I mean, these are, of course, generally more progressive, left-leaning colleges.
Right.
But, the fact that I can talk about things like white supremacy and EJ might have been shocking in 2008, 2009, 2010, kind of uncomfortable or an aha moment. But now I would say not just EA majors, but more generally, the college students are pretty fluent or like aware of these issues, especially around intersectionality.
Yeah.
You hear that across the colleges. I mean, what does it mean to be situated in this society based on who you are and your, vulnerability or privilege?
Yeah.
So, it's interesting, and it's also interesting how sometimes everyone feels like they need to lead with that.
Sure.
And I think it's great and necessary to have an awareness, but you don't have to have that catchphrase everywhere. Right? So that's another thing now I'm thinking, having my advisees think through, okay, like, I don't know if you need a statement on positionality when you're talking about a very technical topic necessarily. So like trying to think about framing and the work that's done. But it hasn't been as uncomfortable as it has been in years past.
Okay. So would you say then, because this is where it kind of sounds like you're going, not just in your classes, but perhaps across the colleges and maybe even beyond that, you feel like would you say there's a resurgence around these topics, especially in environmental justice? I mean, I think typically in environmental justice circles, like you mentioned, there is a sort of a history around contamination. There's a history around particular spaces and the proximity of pollution to certain communities. But those also date back kind of far when you think about the origins of it. But now we have these more recent events. You have these pipeline controversies. You have the issues with the shrinking of monuments. Would you say then that this is a revitalized conversation in the country, or do you think it still has some way to go, or how might you assess it?
I don't know about, a revitalized conversation. I think that this is like a political awakening for a younger generation.
Sure.
And for them, it's implicitly intersectional. It's implicitly not just about one contaminated site. I think young people have a much more holistic grasp on both the need for coalitions and alliances across groups, how to mobilize, and thinking more expansively in relation to justice. So climate justice activists don't just talk about the amount of carbon per parts million.
Right.
They're also talking about fence line communities, who should be spearheading the movements, who should take a step back, how can allies work effectively. They're talking about reinvestment and for economic justice, and building up communities in ways that are based on nonviolent methods of communication. You see multiple ways this conversation is taking place. So I would not say it's not a unified conversation per se, but in all the different ways it's taking place, these things are, what am I trying to say? They're overlapping, they're cross-pollinating. So like Black Lives Matter is also about the environment for climate justice activists, like the resonance between the two, and there's a lot of overlap. So I would just say it's a more diverse movement, and we saw that with the Dakota Access, the pipeline issue too. The people who showed up for that and who are, fighting and resisting and also trying to come up with new visions as they're resisting pipelines and just fossil fuels more generally. And I think people see it as in terms of crisis.
Sure.
We're seeing it in terms of frequency of drought or hurricanes, different kind of weather events. So I think people are tending to maybe see things maybe in a little bit more stark or crisis-oriented terms. And I think it's also exacerbated clearly by our federal government
Yeah.
and all the cutbacks, like you
Right.
said, to national monuments,
Yeah.
the rollback of EPA regulations,
Right.
the assault on California clean air,
Yeah.
clean air cafe standards. I mean, just on and immigration. So there's just multiple levels where I think there's been an assault on both environmental progress as well as civil rights.
Sure,
and
sure.
these are happening together.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they're being rolled back, they're sort of interlocked there. And
Right.
so like the struggle is a broader struggle for both environmental and social justice.
Uh-huh. And so this leads us to sort of I guess kind of close to the final question here, because, there is definitely an awakening, and I think that is pretty clear. I mean, especially, thinking about when we recorded this, I mean, just, a week or so ago, there was the March for Our Lives following the school shooting at Parkland. We've seen the climate march, we've seen the women's march, sort of closer back to, following the election. So there's definitely a lot of stuff happening there. And it's not just physical marches, but it's also online mobilization. But on the flip side of that, I think there's also certainly a fatigue and an exhaustion that can come with that. And, social media, I think, enables us to be bombarded by all these things and all these thoughts at once. And I think a lot of students that I've interacted with have expressed that. So I guess that leads to this question around, what might be your message to people who do feel, obviously they feel there is a crisis, and regardless of what issue that is for them. How do they overcome that fatigue? What would you recommend they do? What are perhaps more accessible or less exhausting ways to engage, or to at least get started without feeling like you're taking on the world? Because it kind of feels like that. I think even for us on a daily basis, it might feel like we're taking on the world, considering everything that's going on. So what might you say to that?
That's a astute point, and it can, of course, for us who are in the center of these environmental issues as teachers, as heads of centers, we're bombarded, and it can be a very bleak picture at times, and certainly it can feel really overwhelming in relation to the social media aspect. And it's easy for me sometimes to get sucked into that vortex of despair. And I think one of the things that is necessary is to kind of step back from that and, to engage actually with a real person or communities. So to build those relationships that are meaningful and that can actually help the day-to-day sustainability of each of us in terms of alternatives and in terms of resistance. So things that I find gratifying are working with the student fellows. Each of the fellows that the Conservancy has had has gone on, and they're doing amazing things in their own right. And these are folks, some of them are working at utilities now.
Yeah.
Some of them are working on the front lines, with EJ communities. Some of them are doing work in policy in DC or with nonprofits. But all I can see is, okay, those are seeds planted. They're all going to bloom and blossom differently, but that is a source of hope. Also just trying to stay really mindful and in the present moment. So what is it that I'm actually capable of doing? I don't think it's helpful to think that we're going to solve all the world's problems.
Right.
But, am I doing the right thing right now with the resources I have available to me? So one of the things I do with the resources I have available to me is try and change the narrative of who gets to speak around environmental issues. Am I making an effort to reach out to women, to scholars of color, people who are doing research on these issues that might not be getting the platform, but their work is excellent?
Right.
It's just, it takes a little bit more effort because the way networks work and the snowball effects work and referrals work, you tend to refer the people you know. And that just generally is how that thing works. As we went to Berkeley, that opened doors for us. We refer the people we know, and takes a little bit of time to pause, look outside those networks and say, okay, what else is happening?
Right.
How can I reach out and diversify? And that's been a great thing to be able to do that.
Sure.
And to say, hey, let's bring this person in.
Yeah.
So, you know, those might seem like small things, but it makes a difference for students who might not see themselves represented to finally see someone who looks like them talking about these issues and then gets them involved. I mean, there's been research done, I believe, on elementary and middle school kids. You know, many kids, and this is totally outside my field, they're kids of color, but the primary educators are white, you know, and that's had like effects. And so I think about that type of thing, and then policy too, right? California is actually pretty progressive on all of these, and you see even in their climate change measures, AB 32, there's always an environmental justice component, and that's because communities have had a voice at the table.
Yeah.
And it's looking at air quality in addition to just greenhouse gases.
Right.
And you know, let's keep going. We cannot afford to take steps back.
Sure.
So that's you know, that's how I try to deal with feeling overwhelmed. And then also just like being humble, right? We tend to make mistakes. People fall, like we are fallible, and that's okay. Like I definitely am the first one to say I'm vulnerable.
Yes.
And it's interesting, you know, like to be very real about the struggles as well as the successes.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good kind of positive note to leave it on.
Okay, great.
So we'll just wrap it up there. Is there any last thing you want to plug? Any upcoming events that you might want to throw in there, or are we at the end of the term now? There's not
well, we have a number of different things at the Conservancy. We have an art exhibit coming up called Ephemeral Natures, where we're exhibiting all the amazing artwork and photographs of that site over time. That's April 28th. If you're interested, you need to meet up by 1 p.m. on April 28th, Saturday, in the lobby of the Broad Performance Space at Pitzer College. And then in the fall, we've got some really exciting climate justice programming. And April 14th, so I'm going back and forth in time here. April 14th, our fellows are partnering with the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice to do an environmental justice tour of the inland region. And if you're interested in that, send me an email.
And we'll make sure that contact info is available. So, Brinda, thank you. Thank you for obliging us and for coming in today. We appreciate it. And so for anyone who's listening, we appreciate your time as well. And if you ever have any requests or questions, not just for our speakers, but for anyone you'd like to hear or any topics you'd like to discuss, feel free to reach out to us at hixsoncenter@hmc.edu. So thanks again for listening, and stay tuned for more.